Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know the kind of stories we tell here. The online romances that turn out to be financial arrangements. The bar girls, the multiple boyfriends, the fake emergencies, and the real heartbreak. We've covered most of it. Today's story is different. And I want you to pay attention to that, because different doesn't mean safer. Sometimes, different means it gets further under your skin, before you notice anything is wrong. His name is Brendan. He's 67 years old, from County Tipperary in Ireland, and he spent his working life doing the kind of labor that most of us will never do, underground, in the dark, pulling coal out of the ground with his hands. He's not a man who makes dramatic decisions. He's not a man who chases things. He's the kind of man who shows up, does the work, and goes home. He came to the Philippines quietly, the way he does everything. No dating apps, no bar crawls, no grand romantic plan. He came because someone mentioned it at a funeral, and the weather sounded good. What happened to Brendan in the 18 months that followed is not a story about being deceived, exactly. It's harder to categorize than that. It involves a woman who was not lying to him, a family that was not fabricating their problems, and a financial situation that still cost him more than he ever intended to spend. I'll let him tell it. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I spent the first part of my working life underground, and the second part wishing one was. That's a joke. Mostly. Origina was the mine. County Roscommon. It was one of the last working coal fields in Ireland. Real coal, not the brown stuff, actual black coal. And I went down my first shaft at 19 years old and thought, well, this is what I am now. And it was for about 11 years, until they closed the place in 1990, and that was that. Gave us all a handshake and a letter and sent us home. I wasn't educated for anything else. I want to be straight about that because it matters to understanding the rest of it. I had my hands, and I had my back, and I had the habit of showing up. So I went into construction laboring, then quarry work, when there was quarry work, back to construction when there wasn't. The Midlands mostly. Some years in Galway. A winter in Kildare I'd rather forget. The work changed, but the shape of it didn't. You came in early, you did what was needed, you went home. Home was Roscommon. Home was Kathleen. We met when I was 24. She was 22, and working in the credit union in Strokestown, and she had an opinion about everything, which I found alarming at first and then indispensable. We were married within the year. That's how it was done, or how we did it anyway. No great drama. She was capable, and she was kind, and she thought I was funnier than I am, which is all you can really ask for. The arrangement, if you want to call it that, was simple enough. She handled people, I handled everything else. She knew every cousin and neighbor, and the backstory of every family for 5 miles in any direction. I fixed things. I built the extension on the back of the house in 2003 with my own hands, just to give you a sense of how that divided. She made the tea and told people which rooms to go with. 31 years of that. No drama, like I said. A daughter, Claire, who lives in Limerick now and has her mother's talent for getting to the point. We were not a family that talked much about feelings. We were a family that got things done and occasionally laughed at ourselves for how much we got done without ever discussing it. Then Kathleen got sick. I'm not going to spend a long time on this part because I can't, really. 3 years. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in 2018, and then 3 years of treatment and hoping, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love get smaller. The last 18 months she couldn't manage much on her own. I became, I suppose you'd say, her carer, though I never used that word and she would have hated it. I drove her to Galway for the treatments. I helped her wash, helped her wash. I slept in the chair beside her hospital bed on the nights they kept her in. because the chair was more comfortable than driving home and coming back at 6 in the morning, and also because I wasn't ready to be in that house without her. She died in January 2021. I sat in the house in Roscommon for the better part of 14 months after that. Claire came when she could. The neighbors were decent. People brought food in the first few weeks, and then they didn't, which is how it goes. I'm not complaining about any of it, I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd been useful for 31 years of marriage and 11 years of caregiving before that, and suddenly there was nothing that needed doing, or nothing I could see anyway. I sold the house in the spring of 2022. It felt like time, and also it didn't, but I did it anyway. €155,000, roughly, after everything was settled. I put it in the credit union and didn't touch it. Touching it felt like deciding something, and I wasn't ready to decide anything. That autumn, there was a funeral in Ballaghaderreen. Third cousin of mine. You go because that's what you do. And afterwards there's tea in the parish hall, and you stand around with people you haven't seen in 20 years, and you talk about nothing, which is exactly what a funeral requires. There was a man named Gary there. Gary Connaughton, we'd been in school together briefly, lost touch, the usual. He'd a nephew out in the Philippines, he said, living there full-time. Said the cost of living was nothing. The weather was something you'd have to experience to believe, and the people were Catholic, properly Catholic, not the going at Christmas kind. I'm not a man who acts on things quickly, or at all, usually, but the house was sold and the credit union account was sitting there, and the winter in Roscommon was doing what Roscommon winters do, and at some point in November I found myself on YouTube at 11 o'clock at night, watching videos about retiring in the Philippines. The kind of videos where some fella in a polo shirt is standing on a balcony with a cold beer, telling you your pension goes 4 times as far, and the mangoes are unbelievable. I watched maybe 6 hours of these, total, over a couple of weeks. That was my research. A man who spent 40 years planning nothing about his working life, where to go next, what needed fixing, just showing up, and he watched 6 hours of YouTube and thought, right so, that'll do. I know how that sounds. I'm telling you how it was. I found out about the SRRV online as well, the Special Resident Retirees Visa, found an agent through a forum, paid the fee, sent the documents, the $20,000 deposit they required. You need to park that money to hold the visa. Barely read. The agent was professional, answered his emails, sorted the paperwork. Everything above board. I told Claire I was taking a holiday. She asked how long. I said I wasn't sure. She did the pause. That means she has more to say and has decided not to say it. She learned that from her mother. I flew to Manila in March 2023, 2 years and 2 months after Kathleen died. I had no idea what I was doing. I want to be clear about that now, because understanding the rest of the story depends on it. I was a 67-year-old man with calcium deposits in his knees and a credit union account he didn't know what to do with. And I was looking, I think, for somewhere to put myself. That's all it was. Somewhere to put myself. And the Philippines, as it turned out, had some thoughts about that. Manila hit me like a door opening onto a furnace. I know people say that about the heat in places like that, and I always thought they were exaggerating. They're not exaggerating. It was the 31st of March and 34 degrees, and the air had a weight to it that I don't have the words for. Thick, wet, diesel-smelling, alive in a way that felt slightly aggressive. I stood outside the arrivals terminal at Ninoy Aquino with my single bag and my SRRV paperwork in a folder, and I thought, I have made a terrible mistake. I hadn't, not yet, but I'm saying the thought was there. The airport area around Parañaque is not, and I say this with all respect, the advertisement for a place. It's flyovers and traffic and jeepneys belching smoke and men on motorbikes threading through gaps that don't exist yet. I took a Grab to the hotel I'd booked in Ermita, which someone on the expat forum had recommended as a decent base for the first couple of nights. The driver had a small Santo Niño on the dashboard, and a phone mounted with a GPS showing me exactly how slowly we were moving through the EDSA traffic. 45 minutes to go, what looked like 5 kilometers on the map. I said nothing. We understood each other. Old part of Manila, a bit faded. The kind of neighborhood that was clearly something once and has been quietly declining since. My hotel room had air conditioning that worked and a window that looked onto a concrete wall. I slept for 11 hours. I spent 2 days in Manila doing what needed doing. A brief visit to the Bureau of Immigration office in Intramuros to register my SRRV, which took most of one morning and involved sitting in a plastic chair in a queue that moved at its own pace regardless of how many people were in it. The staff were polite and efficient once you reached them. The waiting was just the waiting. I've sat in worse queues at hospital appointments. I didn't complain. Manila itself I didn't take to. I walked around Intramuros for an afternoon, the old walled city, which is interesting in the way that things with a long and violent history are always interesting, but the heat made sightseeing feel like punishment. I ate dinner at a carinderia, a small open-front canteen, half a dozen plastic tables, a woman serving rice and adobo from metal pots, and paid 120 pesos for a full plate of food, which is about €2, which did somewhat support the YouTube fella's claims about the cost of living. But Manila wasn't why I'd come. Too big, too loud, too much of everything at once. I'd read about Dumaguete on the forums. Someone had called it the retirement capital of the Philippines, which I'd thought was marketing language but turned out to be more or less accurate, in the sense that it has a larger concentration of retired foreigners than anywhere else I encountered. University town on the south coast of Negros Oriental Island. Quieter, cooler, relatively speaking. I booked a bus to the port at Batangas, then a ferry to Dumaguete. The whole journey took the better part of 8 hours. I slept most of the way. Dumaguete. I'll tell you what I noticed first. It was the right size, not too much. The boulevard runs along the seafront, Rizal Boulevard they call it, with trees along the water and benches and old men sitting on them at all hours, which suited me immediately. The tricycles are everywhere, these small motorbike sidecars that function as taxis and cost about 30 pesos a ride, which is 50 cents. There are 3 universities in the town, so it has a young population alongside the retirees, which keeps it from feeling like it's just waiting for people to die. There's a Robinson's Mall out near the highway if you need one, mostly you don't. I found Gloria's guest house through the same forum. Someone had mentioned it in a thread about budget accommodation, clean, well-run, reasonable at 2,200 a night, roughly 20, centrally located, nothing more than that. I sent a message through the number provided and Gloria replied within an hour with the address and the Wi-Fi password and an hour with the address and the Wi-Fi password and a note that breakfast was included if I wanted it. Practical. I liked that immediately. The guest house was a 2-story concrete building on a side street about 10 minutes' walk from the boulevard, bougainvillea growing up the front wall. A sari-sari store built into the ground floor facing the street, a small convenience shop with a metal grill, selling sachets of shampoo and tins of Milo and bottles of Wilkins water stacked in a refrigerator that hummed loudly. The store was Gloria's as well. She ran everything. She was standing at the front desk when I arrived, writing something in a ledger. 53 years old, I found out later. She looked it, not in a harsh way, just in the way that a person who works hard and has raised children and buried a husband looks their age honestly. Small, serious, hair pulled back. She looked up when I came in and said, "Good afternoon, sir. You must be Brendan, is it?" And I said it was, and she took my passport and wrote something down and showed me to my room. Clean. A single bed, a ceiling fan, a bathroom with a shower head that delivered water at about the temperature of mild surprise. A window onto the back of the building where some chickens moved around in a small yard. On the bedpost, and I noticed it because I was brought up to notice such things, a small wooden rosary, dark wood, worn smooth. Someone had put it there and kept it there. I'm not a man who reads significance into objects, but I noticed it. The first 3 evenings I ate elsewhere, a Chowking on the main street, then a small restaurant near the university that did sinigang, the sour soup with pork and vegetables that I ordered by pointing at the photograph, and that turned out to be one of the better things I've eaten in my life. On the 4th evening it was raining in a way that made going anywhere seem unreasonable, and Gloria knocked on my door at 6 o'clock and said that if I hadn't eaten, there was food. It wasn't quite an invitation. It was more that food was a fact, and she was informing me of it. I went down. The family ate in the room behind the kitchen. Gloria, her son Rodel, who was 28 and had the look of a man who carried more than his share without saying so, his wife Maritis, and 3 children ranging from perhaps 4 to 9 years old. Gloria's mother, a tiny woman named Lola Sita, who sat at the end of the table and ate rice with the focused dignity of someone who has earned the right to concentrate on her food. The meal was chicken adobo and rice and a plate of sliced tomatoes with fish sauce. They made room for me without fuss. The children stared at me. Children always stare at me. Children always stare at me. I have a face that invites staring, apparently. The youngest one, a girl, reached across and touched my arm at one point, then pulled her hand back and laughed. I didn't mind. We talked, or Gloria and I. She'd worked for 10 years in the hotel business in Cebu City when she was younger, she said, which was where she'd learned it. Her husband had died 4 years before. She said it the way you say a fact, without underlining it. I recognized that. I booked another month before I went to bed. I want to be honest about what drew me back to that table every evening after that, because I've thought about it enough to be specific. It wasn't Gloria as a woman, or not only that, it was the household, the way it moved, the way things were needed, and then dealt with, and then needed again. Rodel's tricycle parked out front, the sari-sari store opening at 6 in the morning, Lola Sita's medication sorted into a small plastic box by day. It was a working life. It had the shape of a working life. I hadn't been inside anything that had that shape since Kathleen died. I didn't examine that at the time. I'm examining it now, and I can tell you that not examining it now, and I can tell you that not examining it at the time was the most expensive thing I've ever done. By the end of April, I had a routine. I was up at 6 because the roosters behind the guest house didn't recognize the concept of sleeping in, and because, after 40 years of early starts, my body had simply stopped offering me the choice. I'd walk down to the boulevard before the heat established itself. There's a window of maybe 2 hours in the morning in Dumaguete where the air is almost reasonable, and you learn to use it. I'd walk the length of the waterfront, past the old men and their fishing lines, past the students from the university heading somewhere with their backpacks, past the stalls setting up with cups of taho, a sort of warm silken tofu with syrup that I tried once and found unexpectedly good. Then I'd sit at a small coffee shop called Angan, near the public market, and drink 2 cups of coffee and watch the tricycles going past. And then I'd go back to the guest house, back to Gloria's table in the evenings. That was the shape of it. There were other foreigners about. I'm not going to pretend there weren't. Dumaguete has its share of retired canos. That's what they call Western men there, cano, short for Americano, though they apply it to Irish and everyone else too, sitting on restaurant terraces and comparing pension rates and complaining about the heat they chose to live in. I met a few. A man from Wolverhampton, Dennis, who'd been there 8 years and knew everything about everything and told you so at length. A Dutch fella, whose name I never fully caught, who could talk about the peso-euro exchange rate in a way that made you want to lie down. They were decent enough men. I wasn't looking for that. I hadn't come all this way to sit with a group of older Europeans and recreate the same conversation I could have had in a pub in Roscommon. What I wanted, and I didn't articulate this at the time, but I can now, was to be somewhere that the day had a purpose. And Gloria's household had that in a way that the expat cafe crowd didn't. I think it was the 3rd week when the first money changed hands. I want to be precise about this because the precise details are the whole point. I had been staying a month. I told Gloria I wanted to stay another 2 months at least, probably longer, and I asked her what she'd charge for a longer booking. She gave me a figure, same nightly rate, which was fair. And I said, "What if I paid the 3 months up front?" She said, "That wasn't necessary, sir. Weekly or monthly was fine." I said I'd rather. It was 90,000 for the 3 months, which at the time worked out to roughly 1,500. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said thank you and wrote me a receipt. She wrote me a receipt without being asked. I remember that. At the time, I thought it was just good business practice. It was also the last time I thought about receipts in any useful way. I think about that moment sometimes. Her offering the receipt unprompted. Whether it was professional habit or whether it was something more deliberate, here is documentation, here is legitimacy, here is proof that this transaction was clean. I don't know. I genuinely don't know, and I've stopped trying to decide. The school fees came about 2 weeks after that. Gloria mentioned, not as a request, she was careful about this, always careful about the framing, that her granddaughter Maya had secondary school enrollment coming up, and there were fees involved. Maya was 9, Rodel and Marizi's eldest. Sharp little thing, always doing something with a pencil and a copybook at the kitchen table. The fees were for 18,000, she said. About 18,000, she said. About 30,000. And she said it the way you might mention that the roof needs looking at. Not a demand, just a fact in the air. I said I'd cover. She started to say that wasn't necessary, and I said it was fine. It's school, and that was the end of it. I want to be honest about my own reasoning there because there was nothing complicated about it. I was a man with 15,500 in a credit union account. That €300 for a child's education was nothing. It was less than I'd spent on oil for the heating in Roscommon in a bad winter. What kind of man says no to that? That was the thought. And it was a genuine thought. I'm not rewriting it now to make myself look foolish. At the top, the tricycle was the third thing, and it came maybe a week after Maya's school fees. Rodel's tricycle was the household's main working income outside the guest house and the Sari Sari store. He ran a route between the boulevard and the market and out toward the university, all day, every day. You get to know a man a little over 4 weeks of sharing meals with him, even if neither of you talks much, which Rodel and I didn't. He reminded me of myself at that age, not in any specific way, just in the way of a young man who works without complaint and has accepted that this is what his life is for now. The tricycle needed a significant repair. Something in the engine, I didn't get the full details. The cost was 35,000, which is about 50-80. Without the repair, it couldn't run. Without it running, Rodel couldn't work. Gloria didn't ask me directly. She mentioned the situation after dinner one evening. Rodel was quiet. She said, because of the and I said, what's the repair cost? And she told me. And I said I'd sort it. Rodel fixed the tricycle the next morning. He didn't say much to me about it, but for the next week he brought me a San Miguel from the Sari Sari store each evening when he came in from work and set it on the table without comment. That was, I understood, what gratitude looked like in that household. You didn't make speeches. You did something. I understood that completely. After the tricycle, something shifted. I noticed it without naming it for weeks. Gloria was warmer, isn't quite. She remembered how I took my coffee without asking anymore. She left a small fan in my room before I mentioned the heat was getting to me at night. She asked after my knee once, after I mentioned it in passing. Small things. The kind of attentiveness that feels, if you're a man who lives alone and doesn't get much of it, like being seen. I didn't think about what it meant. I should tell you that now, clearly. I was a 67-year-old man who'd spent 3 years being the person who did the noticing and the attending, and now someone was doing it for me, and I received it. Like a plant that's been in poor light receiving some sun. I didn't ask what it was, or where it came from, or what it cost. There's one other thing I want to say about this period, and it's something I noticed at the time but didn't understand until much later. In all the conversations I had with Gloria in those first 2 months, she never once asked me about my life in Ireland, not in any real way. She knew I was a widower. She knew I was a widower. She knew I had a daughter. She'd seen my Irish passport. But she never asked what Kathleen was like, or what the house in Roscommon looked like, or what I'd done for 40 years before arriving at her front door. We talked about the guest house, about Dumaguete, about her children and grandchildren, about the weather and the market prices and the electricity bills. She received, I gave, the conversation only ever ran the one direction. I didn't notice that as a problem. I noticed it as comfortable. I'd spent 3 years talking about Kathleen's illness to doctors and nurses and to Claire and to the neighbors who asked. Not having to talk about it was a relief. I mistook her not asking for consideration. Maybe it was. I still can't tell you for certain that it wasn't. Sometime in May, without any formal conversation about it, I stopped being a guest. I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened. There was no moment where Gloria said, "Stay," or where I said, "Right, I'm staying." It was more like the guest house simply stopped treating me as a temporary thing. Marit started leaving a cup of coffee outside my door in the mornings before I woke. The grandchildren began using my room as a shortcut to the backyard, which I didn't mind. And one evening, after a long day where the heat had been particularly unreasonable, and we'd both been tired, I stayed in Gloria's room rather than going back to my own. And after that the arrangement shifted, quietly, without discussion, the way arrangements do when neither person is the type to discuss things. I want to be clear about something here because I think it matters to understanding the full picture. This wasn't just a financial transaction with companionship attached. That would be easier to explain. Gloria and we suited each other in the specific way that 2 quiet, practical people who have both lost someone can suit each other. We didn't talk about feelings. We didn't make plans or promises. We just occupied the same space. And it worked, and I was grateful for it in a way I couldn't have articulated then. I'm not sure I couldn't have articulated then. I'm not sure I can now either. But I want it on record that it was. That part was real. The monthly figure had, by June, settled into a kind of my Irish pension, the contributory state pension, which comes to roughly $1,100 a month, was landing in my credit union account back home. I was drawing on my savings for the larger things. For the day-to-day I was spending across groceries from the market, the electricity bill, Lola Sita's medications from Mercury Drug, the occasional emergency for the Sari Sari store, something in the range of 60,000 a month. That's about Tina 1,000. It didn't feel like much. I'd been spending more than that maintaining the house in Roscommon, and the pension was covering most of it. Or I told myself the pension was covering most of it. I wasn't doing the sums carefully enough to know for certain. Lola Sita's medications were the one thing I went to see for myself. I want to say that clearly. I accompanied Gloria to Mercury Drug one morning in June, and I saw the prescriptions, hypertension medication, something for her blood sugar, a third one I didn't recognize, and I saw the pharmacist fill them, and I saw the prices. It came to Tumber 4,800 that month, about 80. Gloria paid from her purse, and I reimbursed her at home. The prescriptions were real. The old woman was genuine. This wasn't invented. The children had started calling me Lolo by July. Grandfather. The youngest one, the girl who'd touched my arm that first evening, started it, and the others followed. I didn't encourage it, and I didn't discourage it. I didn't know what to do with it. I'm not sure I know what to do with it now. I didn't mention any of this to Claire. Our calls had been weekly when I first arrived and had drifted to fortnightly. She asked how things were going. I said grand. She asked if I was meeting people. I said a few. I said yes, which was true and would have been funny in context if I'd wanted to explain the context, which I didn't. I think about those calls sometimes. What she was actually asking beneath what she was asking, and what I was actually answering. But she's her mother's daughter, Claire. She doesn't force what isn't ready to come out. She waited. The extended family began arriving in August. Gloria's brother Ernesto came from Cebu City for a week, stayed in one of the guest house rooms, which was fair enough. He was a stocky, cheerful man in his late 40s who fished for a living and had opinions about basketball. We got along tolerably. On his last night he mentioned, through Gloria and with apologies for the trouble, that his fishing boat had an engine problem. He'd priced the repair at 45,000. He had half. He was short, the other half. He showed me his phone, with the repair estimate on it, the boatyard's name, the itemized parts, 45,000. About 750. I paid it. Of course I paid it. The man had a livelihood that depended on a boat with a working engine, and the documentation was in front of me, and W750 was, I didn't even feel it, honestly, against what I had. Ernesto shook my hand when he left and said something in Cebuano to Gloria that made her nod. I didn't ask what it was. A niece appeared in the story in September. Gloria's niece, her sister's daughter, whose husband had lost his construction job, 2 months behind on rent. The amount was 20,000 for 30/30 for the 2 months they owed. Gloria told me about it on a Tuesday evening while we were eating pancit rice noodles, a simple dish, one of the things Marites made when she was pressed for time. She told me about the niece, the way she told me about everything, factually, with context, without direct request. Just a situation in the air. I think about the Tuesday evenings a lot. Which tells you something about how comfortable the whole thing had become. And here I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Dennis from Wolverhampton, because I dismissed it at the time and I've thought about it since. We were sitting outside a cafe near the Robinsons on a Thursday afternoon. Dennis, me, and the Dutch fella whose name I never got right. Dennis had been in Dumaguete 8 years and had survived 2 relationships and what he described with characteristic West Midlands understatement as a few financial learning experiences. He said to me at some point during a conversation I can't fully reconstruct, "You know, you're the family ATM now." He said it mildly, not unkindly. as a statement of fact from a man who had been the family ATM and recognized the symptoms. I said I didn't see it that way. I said these were genuinely poor people with genuine needs, which was true, and that I had more money than I needed sitting in an account doing nothing, which was also true. I said something about how it was no different than you'd do for neighbors back home if you had the means. Dennis just nodded and ordered another coffee. He'd been there 8 years. He'd had the same conversation with himself. I dismissed him because he was twice divorced and bitter about it, and because I didn't want to hear what he was saying, and because I knew he was at least partly right, and I wasn't ready to sit with that. But here's the thing about genuinely poor people with genuine needs. Both of those things can be true, completely, verifiably true, and the pipeline can still have no off switch. That's the thing I didn't understand then and couldn't have been told. The poverty is real. The problems are real. And none of that means there's a limit to how many real problems can be routed through one man before he runs dry. One evening in September, after the children had gone to bed and Lola Sita had been settled for the night, Gloria and I were sitting with the television on low in the background, and she said quietly, without looking at me, "You know, I think God sent you to us." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. I was raised Catholic enough that this landed somewhere it shouldn't have been touched. I believed she meant it. I also, and this is the part one couldn't have said out loud then, I also felt, underneath the being moved by it, something small and cold that I didn't examine. Something that noticed the timing. Something that filed it away. I didn't listen to that small cold thing for another 4 months. In October, I decided to look properly at the SRRV. I don't know what prompted it exactly. Something about the Mindanao request, I'll get to that, had unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake, and when I'm unsettled I tend to do what I've always done. I look at the physical. At Arigna, before you went down a section, you checked your supports. You didn't rely on the assumption that someone else had done it. That habit doesn't leave you. So I sent an email to the Bureau of Immigration's inquiry address asking about the conditions around the SRRV deposit. $20,000, which I'd transferred as part of the application, lodged with a government-approved bank as a requirement of holding the visa. I'd read the basic terms when I applied, but I hadn't read them carefully. There's a difference. The reply took 11 days, which is its own kind of answer about how the Bureau of Immigration handles queries. When it came, it confirmed what I was beginning to suspect from forum posts. Withdrawing the deposit didn't just reduce my balance. It effectively terminated the visa. Full withdrawal meant I was expected to depart the country within a set period. There were provisions for partial use, medical expenses, tourism investments, but they were restricted and required formal application. My original visa agent didn't respond to my follow-up email. I don't hold that against him specifically. The terms had been available to me, and I hadn't read them closely enough. That's on me. I spent 3 weeks asking questions in expat forums and getting contradictory answers, which is what expat forums do best. Some people said the deposit was fully locked. Some said you could access a portion for approved purposes. One man said he'd retrieved his entire deposit without issue and left, but he offered no documentation, and his posting history suggested he embellished things. The BI office on the main road in Dumaguete was helpful in the way that bureaucratic offices are helpful, politely, in writing, very slowly, and without committing to anything definitive. What I understood, eventually, was this. My 15,500 credit union account back home was mine and accessible. The 20,000 SRRV deposit was not mine in any practical sense while I remained in the Philippines and wished to remain legally. It was parked. It was a condition of presence. I hadn't fully understood that when I put it in, and I'm saying so now because I suspect I'm not the only man who read the headline figure and not the fine print. So that was the visa situation in October. Uncomfortable but not catastrophic. I pushed it to one side because there was something else pressing. Rodell wanted to expand. He raised it himself, which was unusual. Rodell wanted to expand. He raised it himself, which was unusual. Rodell wasn't a man who asked for things directly. He had his mother's way of presenting situations rather than requests. But this time he came to me after dinner, his phone out, a price from a second-hand vehicle dealer in Cebu for a second tricycle unit at 180,000. About 180,000. He said he'd hire a driver, split the routes, build up a small operation. He said he'd pay me back from the earnings. Gloria was present, but let him speak for himself, which I also noted. At the time, I thought it showed respect for his independence. Now I think it was simply that this one was too large for her usual framing. She needed him to ask it plainly. I said I'd think about it. I said 80,000 was a significant amount, and I'd need a day or two. Rodell nodded. He was 28 years old, and he had his mother's quiet dignity, and he didn't push. Neither did Gloria Dot. Nothing was said. But that evening the atmosphere in the house was different, not hostile, just cooler. The conversation at dinner shorter. Gloria's attentiveness that I'd grown, accustomed to, slightly withdrawn. She wasn't punishing me. I don't think she was consciously doing anything at all. But the warmth of the household had a temperature, and the temperature dropped several degrees the moment I said I needed to think. I agreed to half 90,000, roughly yuan 500. I said clearly, to both of them, that this was a gift and not a loan, that I didn't want any arrangement about repayment because I knew it would never come, and I didn't want Rodell carrying that weight. Rodell said he would repay me. I said he didn't need to. We did not write anything down. I want to address that directly. I didn't write it down. I knew I wasn't getting it because the warmth of the household had come back the moment I said yes, and I needed that warmth more than I needed 90,000. That's the honest account of it. Claire called at some point in November. I couldn't tell you the exact date. The calls had dropped to once a fortnight, sometimes 3 weeks apart, because I'd become vague and she'd become careful in response. She asked when I was coming home. I said I wasn't sure yet. She said it had been 8 months. I said I knew. She asked if I was all right. I said I was grand. There was the kind of pause her mother used to use when she knew she wasn't getting the full story, but had decided not to press. Right, Claire said. Then, you know you can ring me if you need anything. I know that, I said. She believed me. She shouldn't have, not entirely. But she's like me in some ways, Claire. She doesn't ask for what won't be given freely. She waits. It was around this same time, November going into December, that I started keeping the notebook. I bought it in a national bookstore on the main street in Dumaguete, a small plain notebook with a red cover. I told myself it was for keeping track of expenses for tax purposes. I have no tax obligations in the Philippines. I knew I had no tax obligations in the Philippines. I bought the notebook anyway, and I started writing things down. Dates, amounts, what each payment was for, and I told myself I was being organized. I wasn't being organized. I was doing what a man does when something is troubling him and he can't name it yet. I was making it visible, not to anyone else. Just to myself. Just so the number would exist. Then came the Mindanao request. December. A man named Eddie, Gloria's sister's husband, who I had never met and had heard mentioned perhaps twice, had a medical bill from a hospital in Cagayan de Oro. $35,000, about 580 desh. Gloria came to me with it on a weeknight, apologetically, hat in hand, as close to hat in hand as Gloria ever came, which was not very close, but closer than usual. I said I needed to think about it. "Just a day or two," I said. "I want to be sure I have the funds to hand." This was not true. For the first time in 8 months, my default answer was not yes. What happened over the next 3 days was nothing dramatic. No argument, no tears, no accusation. It was subtler and, I think, more revealing. The morning coffee that Marites left outside my door didn't appear for 2 days. Gloria was present but occupied, always busy with something else when I was in the room. The children were no quieter than usual, but somehow I was less part of the noise. The household simply contracted slightly. The way a room gets cooler. I want to be very clear about why. Not because I was pressured. Not because anyone threatened me or even asked again. I paid because not paying had changed the temperature, and I couldn't stand the temperature being changed. I would rather give money I didn't owe to a stranger in Mindanao than sit in that household feeling its warmth recede from me. That, right there, is the thing I think about now. Not the 580. The 35,000 is nothing. What it cost is the information it contained, that I had been paying for something all along, and the something wasn't accommodation and groceries and school fees and boat engines. The something was belonging. And the price of belonging had never been stated, and had no ceiling, and renewed itself every time a new situation appeared in the air. I opened the red notebook that night and looked at what I'd written so far. The numbers didn't shock me. The trajectory did. January in Dumaguete is about as close to cool as it gets. Still warm by any Irish standard, but the wet heat of the rainy season had passed, and there were mornings where you could sit outside at Angan without feeling like you were being slowly pressed flat. I'd been going there less frequently. I'd been going most places less frequently. I was spending more time in the guest house, which tells you something, though I couldn't have told you what at the time. I retrieved the notebook on a Tuesday evening. Gloria was at the Sari Sari store dealing with a delivery. The grandchildren were at a neighbor's house. There was some birthday party on the street, music and karaoke bleeding through the walls at a volume that suggested the neighbors had no concept of the idea that sound had limits. I sat on the edge of the bed in what had been my room and was now our room, and I opened the red cover and I started adding up. I want to describe this accurately because the way I did it matters. I didn't sit down intending to reach a conclusion. I sat down to do what I'd always done before making a decision about a job, to look at the materials, to estimate the load, to see what the structure actually was before deciding if it would hold. That's all it was. A survey. The first evening I got the monthly figures straight. The 60,000 running costs, the irregular amounts on top of that. The second evening I added the larger individual payments, the upfront accommodation, Maya's school fees, the tricycle repair, the boat engine, Rodell's expansion, the various family requests. The third evening I converted everything to euro at the rates I'd been using at the time and added the column, 34,120 euro. Across 14 months. I checked it twice. The second time I got 34,080, which is close enough. I put the notebook down on the bed and looked at the ceiling fan turning. It was quiet enough that I could hear the Sari Sari store refrigerator humming through the floor below. The karaoke next door had moved on to something slow and slightly off-key, a woman's voice, and it drifted up through the warm air. And I sat with the number and didn't do anything with it for a while. The number, in itself, was not the disaster. I want to say that clearly, because I think people watching this might expect a different kind of story. I still had roughly 10,008,000 in the credit union. My pension continued arriving. I was not ruined. I was not even badly hurt by the financial standards of some of the stories you'll find on this channel. What I was doing, sitting there with the ceiling fan and the number of the off-key karaoke, was something else. I was doing the projection, because the thing about 34,000 over 14 months is that it isn't a fixed cost. It isn't rent. It isn't a subscription you can cancel. It's a trajectory, and the trajectory had been pointed in one direction since the first Tuesday evening when I said yes to school fees, and it had never once flattened. If I stayed another 14 months at this rate, the number doubled. If I stayed 5 years, I would be an old man with diminishing savings in a country where I couldn't own property, dependent on a visa that was contingent on a $20,000 deposit I couldn't access, providing for a family that had organized its financial expectations around my continued presence and generosity. That's not a life. That's a slow disappearance. I didn't tell Gloria any of this. I'm not a man who announces that he's thinking. I just started watching. And watching differently is its own kind of revelation. I found a Filipino lawyer, Reyes, in Dumaguete City, who handled retirement and immigration matters, and came recommended by 3 separate people whose judgment seemed sound. I paid $25,000, about $415, for a consultation. He was a precise, unhurried man who explained the SRRV cancellation process without theatrics. The deposit could be retrieved, he said. The process was formal. An application to the Bureau of Immigration, a waiting period of 3 to 6 months, a requirement to formally depart the country before funds were released. He didn't ask me why I was considering it. I didn't tell him. We shook hands, and I went back to the guest house and I watched. I watched for 3 more weeks before I booked anything. What I was watching for was whether I was wrong about the trajectory, whether, given time and a different eye, the household would reveal itself to be something other than what the notebook said it was. I have been wrong before. I am not a man who trusts his own judgment unconditionally. I've spent too many years working under other men's estimates that turned out to be off to think my own readings are infallible. But the watching confirmed it. In 3 weeks, I saw 2 new requests arrive through Gloria, one for a relative's child needing school materials, a dowis $8,000, about certain 30, which she mentioned so lightly it barely registered as a request at all, and one for Maritza's sister in Cebu who needed help with a deposit on a room, see verse 15,250. Both real, both small, both entirely in keeping with every request that had come before. And both delivered with the ease of someone presenting an established process, not asking for an exception. There was no single request I could point to and say, that one, that's the line. That's what I mean when I say it was the accumulated weight. It wasn't any one thing. It was the shape the thing had become, and the shape it would continue to become if I stayed in it. Gloria asked me one evening during this watching period if something was wrong. She was direct about it, which was unusual. She preferred the indirect approach, as I've described. But she must have felt the change in me because she looked at me across the table after dinner, with the television on and the grandchildren doing their homework on the floor, and she said quietly, "Brendan, are you all right?" I said yes. "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired." She looked at me a moment longer than usual, and then she nodded and said nothing more. That's the one thing I'm not entirely clean about in this story. Everything else I can account for. That moment, I told her a lie, which is the only straightforward lie in 14 months, and it sits in me differently. I booked the flights in the last week of April, Manila first, then Abu Dhabi, then Dublin. I told Gloria 2 weeks before I was due to leave. She received it the way she received everything, without drama, without raised voices, with the same dignified practicality she brought to every situation the household had ever faced. She said she hoped I would be well. She asked if I had everything sorted with my visa people. I said I had a lawyer handling it. She nodded. The grandchildren asked when I was coming back. The youngest one, the girl, looked at me with Lola Sitta's focused directness and said, "Lolo, when?" I said I didn't know, which was the truth. I want to tell you the hardest part, and then one'll be done with this chapter, because there's not much more to say about it. The hardest part was not the money. The hardest part was that her sadness, when I told her I was leaving, was quiet and genuine and real, not performed, not manufactured to change my mind. She was sad the way a person is sad when something they'd grown accustomed to is ending. And I recognized that too. Because I'd felt it before, at the end of other things, and there's no mistaking what it looks like on a person's face. Gloria was not entirely what I needed her to be, but she was not nothing either. Both of those things are true, and I carry them both home. The flight from Manila to Abu Dhabi leaves at 2 in the morning, which means you sit in Ninoy Aquino for 4 hours, in that specific airport tiredness, where everything is too bright and slightly unreal. I bought a bottle of water and a packet of biscuits from a 7-Eleven in the terminal and sat with my bag between my feet and watched the departures board. The gate didn't open for 2 hours. I didn't mind. I've waited in worse places for longer. I wasn't thinking about Gloria. I wasn't thinking about much. That's the honest answer. I was just moving through the steps. Gate, boarding, seat, seatbelt, the particular roar of a plane deciding to commit. I slept somewhere over the Arabian Sea and woke up with my neck at a wrong angle and a dry mouth and the cabin dark around me, and I thought, clearly and without drama, I'm going home. I hadn't thought of Ireland as home in 14 months. It was interesting to notice. Claire was at arrivals in Dublin. She'd driven up from Limerick that morning, which she didn't make a fuss of, but which I noted. She didn't make a fuss of, but which I noted. She's practical, Claire. She doesn't make fusses. She looked at me when I came through the doors. I could see her doing the assessment, the way she's always done it, the quick read she got from her mother, and she said, "You look thinner." I said the food was good. She said that didn't make sense. I said no, I suppose it doesn't. She didn't ask anything else for the first hour. We drove the motorway south in the kind of Irish weather that reminds you why people leave. Low gray sky, drizzle that couldn't commit to being proper rain, and she put the heat on and asked if I wanted to stop for coffee, and I said I was fine. And we drove, and it was, actually, fine. She asked eventually, somewhere around Port Louise, "How much did you spend?" I said, 8,000. She didn't respond. I said, 8,000. She didn't respond immediately. I watched the road. She said, "No." And that was that. She was raised by a man who doesn't elaborate, and she didn't press, and I was grateful for it in the way I'm often grateful for things I don't deserve. The spare room in Limerick is small. A single bed, a chest of drawers, a window onto the back garden where Claire keeps some pots of herbs that do better than you'd expect in the Irish climate. It's not ideal for either of us. I know that, she knows that, but it's manageable. And manageable is what I needed. I'm not a man who requires comfort. I require function. The room functions. The SRRV deposit Reyes is handling the correspondence, as agreed. The Bureau of Immigration process moves at its own pace, which is to say slowly but not impossibly. I expect the 20,000 back within the year. When it comes, it will go into the credit union alongside the 108,000 that's already there, and the pension will continue arriving each month. And I will be fine. More than fine by any reasonable measure. I am not a man sitting in ruins. I want to be clear about that because I think it's important to say. I went to the Philippines. I spent $34,000 in 14 months. I came home with more than 100,000 and my health and a slightly better understanding of myself than I had when I left. By the financial standards of catastrophe, this is not catastrophe, I know that. What I'm still working out is the other part. Point 1 went to the Philippines, a widower who hadn't grieved properly. I know that now, though I didn't have those words for it when I boarded the plane in Dublin. I thought I was taking a holiday. I thought the problem was the empty house and the Roscommon winter and the credit union account with nowhere to go. Those were all real problems. They just weren't the actual problem. The actual problem was that I had spent 31 years being useful to Kathleen, and 3 years being useful in the specific and terrible way of watching someone die and making it as bearable as you can. And then she was gone, and the usefulness had nowhere to go. And a man with nowhere to put his usefulness is a dangerous thing to introduce to a household that needs one. It needed, in fact, exactly what I was offering, and I gave it freely and generously and without being asked to, and none of that makes it a simpler story to tell. She was not a villain. I want to say that again because I mean it, and because I think the temptation, listening to this, is to decide she was. She was a woman with an elderly mother and a son who needed support and a guest house that ran on thin margins and an extended family with real problems in a country where the poverty is not abstract, it is a Tuesday evening fact. She had spent her life managing that with whatever tools were available. I walked in with money and a hole in me shaped exactly like usefulness, and she received what I gave. That is not theft. That is not a scam. That is two people meeting at the intersection of their separate needs and staying there until one of them did the arithmetic. I should have done the arithmetic sooner. That's the whole of it. If you're watching this because you're thinking about retiring to the Philippines, and I want to say clearly that it can work, I've met men for whom it works. Dennis from Wolverhampton has been there 8 years and hasn't lost the house. Then here's what I'd tell you, for what it's worth from a man who got it wrong. Read the SRRV terms before you apply. Not the summary. The actual terms before you apply. The actual terms. Engage a lawyer first, not after. Understand that the deposit is not a savings account you can access. It is collateral for your legal presence in the country. I was fortunate that my other money was protected. Not everyone is. And the other thing, the harder thing. Know what you're going for. Not the cost of living figures, not the weather, not the YouTube fella on the veranda with the San Miguel. Know what you're actually trying to solve. Because the Philippines will meet you wherever you are. If you arrive with a clear head and a plan and reasonable expectations, and the ability to say no when no is the right answer, it can be a fine place to spend your retirement. But if you arrive hollow, and I mean that specifically, I mean grieving something you haven't named yet, it will fill that hollow for you, and it will charge you for the filling. And the price will keep going up. And you will feel grateful right up until the evening you sit on the edge of the bed with a red notebook and do the sums. I don't regret going. I want to be clear about that as well. I regret not knowing why I was going. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference is about 40 years of quarry work and the particular quality of silence that puts in you, and a woman named Kathleen who handled people while I handled everything else, and 14 months on Rizal Boulevard, watching the tricycles go by in the mornings, thinking I'd found somewhere to put myself. I had. Just not in the way I'd intended. And that, in the end, is both the warning and the only honest conclusion I have. That's Brendan's story. I want to thank him for telling it the way he did, without bitterness, without score settling, with the particular kind of honesty that costs something to maintain. What strikes me about it, sitting with it now, is what it isn't. It isn't the story we usually tell on this channel. There's no catfishing, no fake profile, no bar girl, no stolen passport, no cancer emergency that turned out to be a holiday fund. The money was never taken. It was given freely by a man who needed to give it to people who needed to receive it, inside a system of cultural that is actually the more common story. The dramatic scams get the attention because they have clear villains and clear victims and a satisfying shape. But the quiet drain, the slow, consensual, culturally logical drain, happens to more men than will ever admit it. Because it's harder to explain without sounding foolish, and because the people on the other side weren't lying to you, and because some part of what happened felt real and maybe even was. If you're considering retirement in the Philippines, the question you need to answer before you book the flight isn't, "Can I afford it?" It's, "Do I know what I'm trying to fix?" Because the Philippines will meet you wherever you are. And if where you are is hollow, it will fill that space, and it will charge you for it, and you will feel grateful right up until you do the arithmetic. Thanks for watching Inside the Philippines. If Brendan's story raised questions about the SRRV or retirement visa options, there are links in the description. Comments are open, we read them. Subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you in the next one.